This is my true story. After my husband died, my only hope was my daughter, that she would take care of me. But my daughter told me, "Get out or I'll call the cops." All I wanted was someone to talk to me, listen to me. But I never expected my daughter to treat me like this. One evening, I heard them whispering, saying I was dead weight and killing their vibe. The next morning, I found my suitcase by the door. When I asked why, my daughter said, "Get out or I'll call the cops. This isn't your house. You're not my responsibility." I walked out with a tear, but I didn't go to a shelter. I went to my lawyer. But you won't believe what I did next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. I raised my daughter with hands that never stopped moving. From the moment she took her first breath, I made sure the world around her was soft, safe, and clean. I stitched her dresses by hand when we couldn't afford store-bought ones, brushing away tears with one hand and darning fabric with the other. I stood in line for hours to enroll her in the best schools, packing her lunches with notes tucked beneath the sandwiches that always said things like, "I'm proud of you," or "You can do anything." When she was sick, I slept on the floor beside her bed, taking her temperature every hour without ever closing my eyes. When she was afraid, I stayed up all night telling her stories, holding her until the tremble in her chest became a sigh of peace. I watched her grow from a quiet, curious girl into a confident teenager, and I thought, foolishly, that all of that love would stay somewhere inside her. I never asked her to love me back in the same way, only to remember. To remember that she was raised by a woman who never once put herself first. A woman who skipped meals to make sure her daughter had seconds. A woman who walked to work in the winter just so she could save enough for a prom dress her daughter would wear once. She used to tell me everything: her first crush, her favorite books. She'd run into the kitchen after school and talk for hours while I cooked, and I'd listen to every word like it was a song. But time, it seems, doesn't always deepen love. Sometimes it drains it dry. The talks became shorter, then they stopped. She got older, made friends I didn't know, met people I never saw. And slowly, I became less of a mother and more of a background noise. She moved out young and called occasionally, but the warmth in her voice disappeared like morning fog. I thought it was just growing up. I thought she'd come back around. That maybe one day she'd say, "I see now what you did for me." But that day never came. And yet I still showed up for her. At her wedding, with a smile I forced through the ache of standing alone while her husband's family took up the front rows. I brought her gifts during every visit. I held her babies when she let me and loved them with the same fierce quietness I gave her. But the distance grew. Every visit felt shorter, colder. She began correcting the way I spoke in front of others. She made jokes about how old people can't keep up. And every time I left her house, I would sit in my car for a moment longer than necessary, trying to breathe. Still, I made excuses. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe she just didn't know how to be gentle because no one had ever asked her to be. I didn't want to admit that the little girl I had loved with my entire being had grown into a woman who no longer saw me as anything more than an obligation. I remembered one birthday, hers, when I showed up with a handmade quilt I'd spent months sewing, every square filled with a fabric tied to her childhood. Her favorite old sweater, the curtains from her nursery, a piece of my wedding dress. She took it with a nod, said, "Thanks," and never brought it up again. The next time I visited, I saw it folded in a pile of unused things in the back room, gathering dust. That quilt was the last thing I made for her. Something in me stopped creating after that. I stopped writing cards, stopped bringing things. I started coming with empty hands, and even those felt too full for her liking. Once, when I asked if I could stay the weekend, she sighed as if I'd asked for her house. So I left the same night. But even through the silence, I kept showing up. Because that's what mothers do. We keep showing up, even after the door closes, even after the voices disappear, even after our hands come back empty. We keep loving with the hope that maybe this time they'll see us. Maybe this time they'll remember. I would replay memories in my head during the lonely nights. her small arms wrapped around my legs when she was afraid of thunderstorms, the time she wrote me a letter saying I was her hero, her smile when I surprised her with a homemade cake shaped like her favorite storybook. These things haunted me more than the silence ever could. They reminded me that once I had mattered. Once she had looked at me with something other than inconvenience in her eyes. I clung to those ghosts of love like they were the last threads holding my heart together. And yet, every time I saw her, I felt those threads loosen. A comment here, a look there, the way she never asked how I was sleeping or if I was eating well. I noticed how she checked her phone while I spoke, how she nodded at my words like swatting away a fly. I wasn't a mother to her anymore. I was a piece of the past she wanted to forget, a shadow that followed her around with quiet footsteps she wished she didn't hear. Still, I told myself she didn't mean it, that if I just gave her more space, more patience, more silence, maybe she'd come back to me. Maybe she'd remember that I was her beginning. But in doing that, I disappeared. And once you disappear, no one remembers what you ever gave. The distance didn't just grow in silence, it grew in structure. Her house, once open, slowly became a map of restrictions. At first, it was subtle. She'd remind me not to sit in certain spots because they were his favorite chair, or ask me not to leave my slippers near the entryway. I understood. I told myself it was about boundaries, about respect. I folded my clothes tighter, kept my bag zipped, my steps quiet. Then it became patterns. If I opened the kitchen door too loudly, I'd hear them sighing. If I forgot to rinse a plate, it was placed outside my bedroom door the next day with a sticky note. Please clean up after yourself. I began walking softer. I began existing quieter. I began shrinking myself to the shape of whatever they needed me to be, which apparently was invisible. The TV remote vanished one day and never came back. When I asked, she said, "Oh, we stream everything on our phones now," and walked away. I was told not to use the thermostat because they had a system. I was asked not to cook because they were meal prepping. I was told not to flush the toilet late at night because it woke the baby. Slowly, their house became a place I tiptoed through. I began to memorize the sounds that annoyed them, so I could erase them before they happened. I could feel my body becoming quieter, my mind starting to whisper instead of think. And still, I smiled when I saw them. I smiled when I handed her folded laundry. I smiled when I kissed the baby's forehead. But inside, I was breaking into smaller pieces each week. I stopped opening the fridge. I kept granola bars in my purse so I wouldn't have to ask permission to eat. I used the bathroom when they weren't home. I began sleeping in my clothes in case I needed to leave quickly. These are not things you tell your friends, if you have any left. These are not things you admit to yourself when you're someone's mother. But they happen, quietly, repeatedly, and no one sees them but you. Once I poured myself a glass of orange juice, something I'd bought with my own money during a grocery run I insisted on paying for. She walked into the room, stared at the glass, and said, "You could have asked first." I stood there, holding it in both hands like it was stolen. I left it on the counter and walked away. That night, I cried on the floor of my room, not from the juice, but from the way she said it. Like I was a stranger in her space, like I hadn't raised her on coupons and second jobs. I started asking before touching anything. Can I take this blanket? Can I sit here? Is it okay if I wash my clothes now? My own daughter would answer with half eyes and flat words, as if I were the neighbor's dog scratching at the door. But I kept asking, not because I needed permission, but because I didn't want to give her another reason to treat me worse. I made myself easier to ignore, and it worked. I went entire days without being spoken to. I heard them laugh in the living room and turned the volume up on my thoughts. I celebrated small mercies, a day without a cold comment, a night when I was left alone. I would sometimes stare at my reflection in the mirror and try to remember what it felt like to be a person. Not a problem, not a presence, just a person. I wore the same sweater every day because no one noticed what I wore anymore. I stopped brushing my hair some mornings. There didn't seem to be a point. No one looked at me. No one asked if I was okay. Once, I tried to tell her that I was feeling dizzy, that maybe I needed to see a doctor. She said, "It's probably dehydration. You should drink more water." That was it. No offer to help. No concern. No, "Are you okay, Mom?" Just a reminder to drink water like I was a houseplant that hadn't been watered in time. And even then, I thanked her. That's the part that still hurts the most. How thankful I became for the bare minimum. A nod, a gesture, an unkind word that wasn't cruel. I began collecting scraps of civility like a starving dog under a table, and I hated myself for it. But I didn't leave, because part of me still believed she might soften. That if I was good enough, quiet enough, small enough, she might find the little girl inside her who used to say she loved me. That she might remember the mother who stayed up nights making her Halloween costumes, who read her bedtime stories twice just because she asked. But memory is fragile, and it seems hers had cracked in all the wrong places. I had become her embarrassment, her inconvenience, her shadow, and I wore that shame in silence. Even when her husband laughed too loud at my expense. Even when I found my toiletries moved to a lower cabinet so they wouldn't clutter the sink. Even when she bought an air mattress and said I could use that instead of the guest bed, so it's easier to move if we need the room. I nodded and thanked her. For an air mattress. In a house I helped pay for. That was the week I stopped calling myself her mother. Not out loud. Just in my head. Just quietly. The way all things inside me were quiet now. I began counting my existence in small humiliations, not in days or meals or moments, but in the things that told me I was no longer seen. Like when they bought a baby gate and installed it at the hallway entrance, telling me it was for traffic control, even though the baby had already started walking. Or the time I went to take the trash out and found my name written on a label stuck to the back of a plastic bin, as if I were some tenant, not family. There were newer rules every week. I was told to limit my showers, not to flush the toilet during the baby's nap, to keep the bedroom window shut even when it got stuffy because the air conditioning was on a schedule. I wrote down everything in a small notebook I kept hidden in my pillowcase. Not because I wanted to remember, but because I needed to confirm I wasn't going crazy. When you're slowly erased, you start to question your own outline. I'd reread those notes late at night just to prove to myself that what I was experiencing was real. That this wasn't just old age or grief or overreaction. It was calculated disrespect. I could tell when I was being timed. If I spent more than 10 minutes in the bathroom, there'd be a knock. If I took too long to make tea, I'd hear sighs. One day, I stood too long in the pantry deciding if I could eat a granola bar, and when I turned around, her husband was standing there watching me. He didn't say a word, just looked at me like I was blocking his view. I stepped aside and apologized. For breathing, I think. I began to vanish from photographs. They'd take family pictures and ask me to step out so we could get one with just the kids. Then I noticed I wasn't in the holiday cards anymore. I wasn't mentioned in the family updates she posted online. One day, I overheard her on the phone telling a friend, "It's just been hectic with the baby in the house. No extra help around." I stood in the laundry room folding her clothes when she said that. I was the no extra help. I was the invisible. My hands shook, but I finished folding the towels. I always finished. Because it was all I had left. Purpose had become a threadbare thing, but I held on to it with all I had. There's a certain kind of shame that settles in your body when you realize the people you raised have decided you're useless. I felt it in my bones, in my breath, in the way I stopped correcting people when they misremembered things I lived through. What was the point? I wasn't just unwanted, I was inconvenient. An accessory they never chose but were forced to wear. And the guilt of being a burden began to replace the grief of being unloved. I started apologizing for everything. For existing. For taking up space. For asking if I could use the washing machine. For getting in the way of their weekend plans when all I did was sit in the room they gave me. And still, they found ways to remind me that my presence was too loud, too much, too permanent. She once left a brochure on the kitchen table. It was for a senior apartment complex. I asked her about it, and she said, "Just something I picked up. Might be useful one day." I nodded and walked away. I didn't say a word. That night, I stared at the ceiling until the dark turned to light, wondering if I'd already been replaced in her mind. If her future didn't include me at all. And I knew the answer. I saw it in her eyes when I asked if she needed help with anything, and she said, "We're fine. We, as if I were something else. Not part of the we, just part of the furniture, just part of the problem. Even the baby started sensing the silence. Children know. She'd reach for me sometimes, and I could see the tension it caused. Once, when the baby handed me a crayon, my daughter looked annoyed and said, "She does that to everyone." Like love from her child needed to be diluted if it pointed toward me. I smiled anyway. I always smiled. That's what you do when you're no longer allowed to cry. I remembered things in pieces now. How she used to draw me pictures with hearts and glitter glue. How she used to sleep on my chest during thunderstorms. How she used to call me her best friend. I clutched those memories like currency, spending them in the quiet hours when no one saw me. I started going to bed earlier, not because I was tired, but because the nights were safer. Fewer looks, fewer rules, fewer chances to do something wrong. I stopped opening windows, stopped asking questions. I learned how to breathe shallow so I wouldn't disturb the air. I no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. My face had started to look like an apology. My eyes stayed down longer. My hands hovered instead of reaching. I was molding myself into the absence they preferred. And through all of it, I still hoped. That was the part that cut the deepest. That I still held onto some thread of belief that my daughter would look at me and remember who I was. Not the older woman with thinning hair and quiet steps, but the mother who gave her everything, who stayed when no one else did, who never once turned her away, not even on the hardest days. But that memory, whatever part of her it lived in, was gone. She had wiped me out of her history, and now she was working on wiping me out of her present. And still, I stayed. Because I had nowhere else to go. Because I thought maybe staying meant I still had value. Because I couldn't accept that I had raised a child who could make her own mother feel like nothing. But deep down, I knew. The door was closing, not with a slam, but with every quiet rule, every sideways glance, every untouched dinner plate. It was closing, and I was the only one standing on the wrong side of it. It wasn't one moment that broke me. It was all of them, stacked like brittle plates, each one thinner than the last, waiting for one small tremor to send them crashing. There comes a point in a woman's life where the humiliation doesn't sting anymore. It burns, not hot, but slow, like something simmering just under the surface of skin. The week it began to turn was like any other, except everything felt heavier. My joints ached more. My eyes stayed dry longer. I felt like I had aged 10 years in 10 days. She had started locking the pantry. She said it was because things kept going missing, as if I were stealing crumbs from my own bloodline. I never said a word. I just stopped eating after 5 p.m. and started chewing peppermint to keep my stomach from growling. One morning, her husband told me to stay in my room because they were having friends over and didn't want to explain things. Explain what? That the woman folding laundry in the background was his wife's mother? The woman who had paid the deposit on their first apartment? The woman who once gave up new shoes so her daughter could have a brand-name backpack on the first day of high school? But I said nothing. I stayed in my room for 6 hours that day, barely breathing, listening to laughter I was never invited to share. When the guests left, no one came to check on me. They didn't even knock. That night I sat on the floor beside my bed and stared at the blank wall until my legs went numb. It felt fitting, my limbs finally matching the way they treated my presence. Number useless, disposable. The next day I woke up to find my toiletries had been moved. Not just moved, but placed outside my door in a plastic grocery bag. No explanation, no note, just rejection packaged neatly. I put them back in the bathroom quietly. The following day, they were gone again. So I kept them in my room from then on, brushing my teeth with a bottle of water, like a camper stranded in a house that used to be hers. I started spending more time outside, not because the air was better, but because at least outside no one reminded me I wasn't wanted. I sat on the back step, drinking tap water in silence, watching birds land on the neighbor's fence and fly away like they didn't owe anyone anything. I started talking to myself in full sentences, just to hear another voice. I stopped making eye contact when I passed them in the hallway. Not because I was ashamed, I wasn't, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing how hollow I'd become. I existed in silence, But in that silence, something began to shift. Something small, something subtle. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something closer to clarity. A soft, cold awareness that love alone wouldn't save me. That being someone's mother didn't guarantee kindness, didn't protect you from being erased by the very hands you once held steady. I had given everything I had, and somehow, I was still too much. I began to look around the house differently. I saw picture frames that didn't include me, towels I had bought, now used without acknowledgement, furniture I had once helped pick out, now forbidden to me. This wasn't just her home. It was built with my time, my money, my sacrifices, and yet I wasn't even allowed to exist in it. I remembered once coming home from work when she was a teenager and finding her asleep on the couch, the TV still playing. I'd covered her with a blanket and kissed her hair. That couch, the one she once found comfort on, was now the same one I wasn't allowed to sit on because it was reserved for guests. I wasn't even considered a guest anymore, just an inconvenience with a heartbeat. I began to wonder what would happen if I simply disappeared. Would she tell people I'd moved into assisted living? Would she throw my belongings out quietly, without ceremony? Would she cry? I doubted it. I began preparing myself for the possibility of leaving. Not because I wanted to, not because I had anywhere else to go, but because staying had started to feel like begging. And I had never begged. Not even when I was poor. Not even when I was raising her on pennies and hope. But I could feel the time approaching, like an invisible clock ticking toward something final. I began sleeping with my shoes nearby. I kept a spare bag packed just in case. I stopped keeping my toothbrush in the bathroom. These are not things you do when you feel safe. These are the rituals of the forgotten, of someone waiting to be thrown out, hoping they can walk out first. And still, I held on to the last strings of memory. The way she used to hold my hand crossing the street. The way she used to call me Mama when she was sick. The way she once looked at me like I was her world. Those strings were fraying, but I wrapped them around my fingers like a rosary, hoping they'd mean something again. But deep down, I knew the only one holding on was me, and she had already let go. The morning that changed everything didn't begin with shouting. It began with silence, the kind that drapes over a room like a damp sheet. I woke up before anyone else, as I often did. My body was used to it, years of rising before the sun to pack school lunches, iron uniforms, boil tea. I sat in my small room and waited for the house to stir. The walls were thin, but that day even the air felt hollow. Around 9, I heard my daughter and her husband talking in the hallway. The door was cracked just enough for their voices to slip in. They weren't whispering anymore. They didn't care if I heard. "She's been here long enough," he said. "It's getting weird." And then her voice, sharper than I'd ever known it as a child, replied, "She's not even trying to leave. She's just here, like furniture." I remember blinking. That was all I did. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just blinked. Furniture. I had become furniture. Something sat on, leaned against, moved around. Never once considered alive. I spent the rest of the day moving slower. Every step felt like it might crack the floor beneath me. At lunch, they didn't ask if I wanted anything. They made food, sat down, and ate. I sat in my room and chewed a dry biscuit I had kept in my drawer. Later that evening, she told me they were having a dinner party, one of those neighborhood couples and wine events. She said it wasn't really for me and asked if I could stay in my room for the evening. I nodded. I always nodded. She didn't say it with cruelty. She said it with formality, like I was a stranger overstaying my welcome at a hotel that hadn't charged me yet. That night, I listened through the walls as laughter filled the house. Silverware clinking, music humming, chairs scraping against the floor I once mopped on my hands and knees. I felt like I had been buried alive beneath the floorboards, listening to life continue above me, just out of reach. But it wasn't the party that broke me. It was what happened the next morning. I woke up to find my room different. My things, the few I had, were boxed up. My toothbrush, my slippers, my hairbrush, even the framed photo I had kept of her as a baby. All packed away and placed outside the door. She stood there, arms crossed, her eyes already preparing for my reaction. I asked her what was going on, and she said, "We've decided it's time." No apology, no warmth, just a decision I wasn't part of. I asked what I had done wrong. She shrugged. "It's not that. We just need the space. This isn't your house." That sentence, that was the one. Not the cruelest words she'd said, but the most surgical. Clean. Absolute. It severed something inside me that I didn't even know was still attached. I wanted to scream, to ask her how she forgot everything. The time I held her in the hospital when she had pneumonia. The night she called me crying because her boyfriend had left. The loan I gave her for her wedding dress. The years I spent making sure she never felt alone in this world. But I didn't say any of it. I just nodded. Because by then I understood the truth. I wasn't her mother anymore. Not in the way that counted. I was an extra. A ghost that had overstayed her welcome in the scene. I took the box into the room and sat beside it for a long time. I didn't pack anything else. I didn't cry. I just stared at the taped-up edges like they might open up and explain how we got here. How a mother becomes a tenant. How a child becomes a warden. She knocked once in the afternoon and asked if I had made arrangements. "We need the room by Friday," she said. And just like that, I wasn't family. I was a problem with a deadline. That evening, her husband walked past my room and said, "Hope there's no hard feelings." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I realized in that moment how deeply they misunderstood the situation. There were no feelings left to harden. They had already scraped me clean of them. I slept on the floor that night, even though the bed was still there. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of comfort. I wanted to feel the floor, the cold, the finality. I thought about leaving that night, just disappearing into the street, letting them wonder. But I didn't, because I wasn't finished. I didn't have revenge in my heart, not yet. Just something sharper, something deeper. A quiet intention forming like frost on glass. The next morning, I dressed carefully, pressed my clothes, combed my hair, ate nothing, said nothing. When she passed me in the hallway, she didn't meet my eyes. She said, "Thanks for understanding." I said nothing. I walked to the park and sat on a bench for hours, thinking. I thought about my name being on the deed. I thought about the paperwork still in my safe deposit box. I thought about how many times I had let her forget that I existed before this moment. And I thought, no more. That night, I opened the closet and began sorting my documents. Quietly, carefully. I didn't tell her. I didn't need to. Because the woman she had pushed out of her life was not the same woman sitting cross-legged on the floor that night with her name on the house. I was no longer trying to be wanted. I was making sure I was remembered. The thing about breaking points is that they don't come with noise. Not the kind you expect. There's no crash, no scream, no shaking fists or shattering plates. Sometimes, the loudest moment of your life is silent. It happens inside your chest like a final breath held too long. Mine came the day after she gave me the deadline. She didn't ask if I had a place to go. She didn't offer to help me look. She just reminded me, in passing, that the room needed to be cleared by Friday. I nodded. I always nodded. It was my last act of submission, and she didn't even notice it. That night, I laid on the mattress staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me, watching the blades blur and listening to the rhythm of a house that no longer knew I was inside it. And I felt something inside me go quiet, not in fear, not in grief, indecision. A kind of emotional exhale that cleared every last piece of hope from my ribs. That was the night I stopped being her mother. Not biologically, I will always be that, but spiritually, emotionally, in the way that matters. I stopped being the woman who would forgive anything. The woman who remembered the small girl in pigtails every time she was told to be silent. That night, I no longer saw the child. I saw the woman she had become. The woman who looked me in the face and said, "This isn't your house." I closed my eyes and repeated that sentence out loud. "This isn't your house." I said it again, not in anger, in truth. And it changed something. It didn't hurt anymore. It confirmed what I had already started to understand, that I wasn't being pushed out of my daughter's life. I had already been removed a long time ago. This was just the final step. I had become inconvenient to the image she wanted to present to the world. The perfect little family in the perfect little home. And mothers like me didn't fit the furniture. We cluttered it. We complicated the narrative. I realized then that I had outlived my usefulness in her story. And so I decided, silently and with finality, to write my own ending. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be cruel, it would be legal, precise, final. The next morning, I folded all my clothes and placed them neatly in the suitcase she'd once left by the door. I arranged my toiletries in a clear plastic bag. I zipped everything with hands that didn't tremble. Not anymore. I made tea. I sipped it slowly. She passed me in the kitchen and said nothing. Neither did I. It was better that way. I no longer wanted her words. I had stopped believing them a long time ago. After breakfast, I sat down at the small writing desk in my room and took out a notebook. I made a list of everything still in my name. The deed, the insurance, the bank account I kept separate since my husband passed, the emergency fund she never asked about. She had assumed everything was hers, the house, the security, the legacy. She had never once checked. That was her mistake. And now it was my opportunity. I left the notebook open on the desk and stared at the ink bleeding through the paper. Then I looked around the room. Not with sadness, with calculation. Every object, every towel, every chipped mug, I noted it all. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing an exit. Not just from the house, but from the role she'd trapped me in. The silent, helpless mother. I wasn't helpless. I never had been. I had just been trying to be kind. But kindness without respect becomes servitude, and I had served long enough. That afternoon, I went to the library and printed out property forms. Quietly, carefully. I didn't ask for help. I didn't need her husband's lawyer. I knew what to do. The law was slow, but it listened. It listened in ways she never did. I signed nothing. I told no one. I simply began gathering what was mine. I kept my tone the same during dinner. I rinsed my plate, said thank you. I even offered to do the dishes. She declined. Of course she did. I think she thought the victory was complete, that I had finally accepted my place in the shadows. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't in the shadows anymore. I had stepped out. She just hadn't noticed yet. That night, I watched the house go dark, room by room. I listened to them laugh in bed. I listened to them lock the front door. I sat at the window in the hallway and stared at the streetlights, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not because things were okay, but because I had finally let go of the version of her I kept trying to hold on to. The little girl was gone. She had been gone for years, and now I was ready to go too. Not in shame, not in defeat, but in power. I didn't pack everything. I only took what mattered. The paperwork, the deed, the proof. The rest, I left exactly where it was, because soon it wouldn't be mine to worry about. I zipped my suitcase and set it by the door. I folded the blanket at the foot of the bed one last time. Then I lay down in the dark, alone and unafraid. I didn't cry, not even once, because the part of me that had wept for her, that had waited for her to change, had gone silent. And that silence wasn't empty. It was full of decision. I had become invisible in her world. But now, she was going to feel my absence for real. She gave me until Friday. What she didn't know is that I only needed until Tuesday. The suitcase sat by the door for appearances, but the real work was already done. I had spent the past 3 days doing what she never thought I was capable of, preparing. I didn't run, I didn't scream, I didn't plead for her to let me stay. Instead, I walked quietly into the lawyer's office I hadn't visited in over 6 years and handed him the folder I had kept safe since my husband died. Inside, it was everything. The deed with my name still printed in bold, the mortgage records, the will, the insurance, and the unbroken chain of ownership that tied that house to me, not her. Not her husband, me. She had never asked. She assumed. She decorated the rooms, painted the nursery, hosted her friends, and posted her perfect little life online, all from inside a house she never owned. When the lawyer looked up at me after flipping through the papers, he said only 2 words. "Are you sure?" I nodded once. I didn't need to explain. He didn't need to understand the years of quiet cruelty, the powdered milk, the couch rules, the dinner parties I was locked out of. I wasn't asking for sympathy. I was asking for action. The listing went live the next morning. I picked a realtor who didn't ask many questions, just someone polite, fast, and professional. I told him there were tenants living in the home, temporarily, and that the sale needed to move quickly. The market was good. The house had value. Within 48 hours, there were 3 offers. I accepted the second, full cash, no contingencies. The papers were signed before my daughter even remembered I existed that week. She had stopped asking if I needed anything. She was too busy planning their summer vacation. She didn't see me leave on Thursday morning with the realtor to hand him the keys. She didn't notice the new lockbox installed on the door. She didn't know that behind her back, the foundation of everything she took for granted had shifted. Legally, irreversibly. On Friday, she told me to be out by noon. At exactly 11:45 a.m., I rolled my suitcase to the end of the driveway. I stood there for a moment, looking up at the house I once helped build, not with bricks, but with meals and warmth and sacrifice. She didn't come out. No one said goodbye, but I wasn't waiting for them. A black sedan pulled up, and the realtor stepped out in a crisp suit holding a folder. Behind him, a woman in a beige dress and a man with a tape measure stepped onto the lawn. They nodded to me. I handed the realtor the keys. "It's all yours now," I said. I didn't look back. I walked down the street, past the bakery she used to love as a child, past the school she once clung to my arm outside of, past the memories that no longer belonged to me, because she had already buried them in silence. I checked into a motel near the lawyer's office. Nothing fancy, but it had warm light, soft pillows, and no one told me where to sit. I turned on the small television and listened to the quiet hum of a room that didn't hate me. It felt like freedom. The next morning she called. I let it ring. Then she called again, and again. Eventually, the voicemail came through. "Mom, what's going on? There's a sign on the lawn. Someone's here, saying we have to leave. What is this?" Her voice cracked for the first time in years. Not from love, from confusion, from loss, from the realization that the home she treated like her own was never really hers. I stared at the phone. It kept buzzing. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The house was gone. The locks were changed. The new owners were moving in next week. I had signed every page in black ink and watched the notary stamp it with finality. What she took from me in dignity, I reclaimed in silence. This wasn't revenge. This was closure. She had asked me to leave, so I did. She just didn't realize what else would go with me. She didn't lose her mother that week. She lost the roof over her head. The illusion of control. The comfort of assuming the people who raised you will always stay, no matter how cruel you become. She had made it clear I was no longer wanted. I simply gave her what she asked for, on paper, with a signature. I spent that weekend reading, drinking tea, sleeping with both eyes closed for the first time in months. And on Monday, I blocked her number. Not out of hate, but because some endings don't need a conversation. Some doors once closed should never be reopened. Not when you were asked to leave and did so with dignity. Not when your silence spoke louder than any goodbye ever could. The calls didn't stop for days. First it was her number, then her husband's, then an unknown line that left a voicemail begging me to just talk. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because there was nothing left to say. When someone tells you that you're not their responsibility, that your presence is a problem, you have 2 choices. You can beg them to see your worth, or you can leave and make them feel your absence. I chose the second. And it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was paperwork and timing and knowing that ownership isn't always about affection. Sometimes it's about boundaries. The day the new owners moved in, I got a text from her. It was 1 sentence. I didn't know. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no "Mom, Just those 3 words, small and weightless. And yet I could feel the panic behind them, the unraveling. I could picture her standing in the doorway of what she once called her home, realizing that everything she built had rested on a foundation she didn't control. The walls, the floor, the ceiling above her head, they had all belonged to me, just like I once belonged to her, until she decided I didn't. And now we were even. I didn't reply to her message. I didn't need to. Some truths echo loudest in silence. The last I heard, they were staying with her in-laws, temporarily. She hadn't told anyone the full story. Of course she hadn't. Shame doesn't like sunlight. I imagine she told her friends something polite, that I had moved into assisted living, or that there was a sudden sale, something clean, something that didn't require her to say, I kicked my mother out and she took the house with her. But I didn't care what story she told, because the truth was mine. It had always been mine. And now, so was my peace. I spent the first week after the sale doing nothing. Not running errands, not making calls, just existing. I woke up when I wanted to. I drank tea without asking. I read an old book I had forgotten I loved. For the first time in years, no one watched me eat. No one told me where to sit or what to say. I was alone, yes, but I wasn't lonely. Loneliness is what I felt in her house. This was something else. This was relief. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped waiting for her voice. I had heard enough of it in the quietest ways. The rules, the sighs, the cold glances. Sometimes silence doesn't come from the absence of words. It comes from everything that's said without speaking. And she had spoken volumes over the years. Every time she told me to stay in my lane. Every time she made a face when I walked into a room. Every time she handed me something with one hand while holding resentment in the other. So no, I didn't miss her voice. I missed who I thought she was. And that's a very different kind of grief. I mourned the daughter I had raised, the one who used to write me cards with glitter and stickers and tell me I was the best mom in the world. That girl vanished somewhere along the way, replaced by a woman who couldn't look me in the eye unless she needed something. But grief doesn't last forever, and love doesn't either, not when it's not returned. So I let it go, gently, fully. I didn't burn photos. I didn't tear up letters. I just stopped reading them. One day, I pulled out the handmade quilt I'd once given her, the one she had folded and forgotten in the back of a closet, and I laid it across the bed in my motel room. It smelled like dust and time, but it was warm, and it reminded me that once I was proud of the mother I had been, that even if she no longer valued it, I had once been everything to someone. That mattered more than anything now. I didn't wish her harm. I didn't wish her pain. I just wished her gone, from my thoughts, from my days, from the part of me that kept hoping she'd change, because that hope had been the real prison. Not her house, not her rules, the hope, the waiting, the endless forgiving. And when I finally let that go, I felt like a woman again. Not a servant, not a fixture, just a woman with her own name on her own papers. The lawyer called a week later to confirm the last of the paperwork had been filed. "You're officially free," he said with a small laugh. I didn't laugh back. I just said, "Thank you," because I wasn't free that day. I had already been free the moment I chose myself. That moment wasn't in a signature. It was in a silence that followed years of being dismissed, disrespected, and erased. That silence, for once, was mine, and I intended to keep it. I think some people expect revenge to look like rage, like screaming, door slamming, courtroom scenes, or long overdue confrontations full of shaking voices and tears. But real revenge, the kind that lasts, doesn't come with noise. It comes with silence. It comes in forms people don't expect. A deed in your name. A lawyer who doesn't flinch. A signature written without trembling hands. It looks like a mother finally choosing herself after being erased for too long. My daughter thought she'd pushed me out. She didn't realize I had already left a long time ago. Emotionally, spiritually, piece by piece. The moment she stopped seeing me as a mother was the moment she stopped deserving me in her life. And when she told me to get out, she didn't think I'd take anything with me. But I took everything. I took the foundation she stood on. I took the illusion of control. I took the home she thought was hers and replaced it with a consequence she never saw coming. Not to hurt her, but to remind her, kindness has limits, and silence has weight. I don't tell this story because I want pity. I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me. I tell this story because I know there are women like me, quiet, aging, forgotten, who are made to feel small in homes they once built, who are told to stay silent, to stay grateful, to stay out of the way. And I want them to know, you don't have to stay. You don't have to beg to be loved by your own children. You don't have to erase yourself just to make someone else comfortable. You can leave. You can reclaim what's yours. You can close the door without slamming it and never open it again. I haven't spoken to her since the sale. She's tried in small, unsure ways. A card in the mail with no return address. A voicemail that said nothing except, I didn't mean for it to be like this. But she did. That's the thing about people who harm you quietly. They rewrite the story in their heads before you even leave the room. They pretend it was a misunderstanding, that you were too sensitive, that they were just stressed. But I didn't misunderstand anything. I lived every moment of it. I remember the nights spent eating granola bars in silence. I remember the thermostat rules, the locked pantry, the whispered insults. I remember being told not to sit on certain chairs. I remember being labeled dead weight. Those aren't things you forget. And they're not things you forgive just because someone sends a late apology. I still carry love for who she was. The little girl with stickers on her shoes and chalk on her hands. But I don't carry love for who she became. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. Sometimes love has to be buried where it dies, and she buried hers a long time ago. I don't hate her, but I don't need her. And I think that's the most powerful place a mother can arrive in. To realize that your worth isn't tied to how gently you're treated. It's tied to how bravely you let go when they stop treating you like anything at all. These days, I wake up slowly. I walk outside without asking permission. I drink tea from a cup I picked out myself. The silence I live in now is not the kind they gave me. It's the kind I chose. It's the kind that holds me like a blanket, not a muzzle. I no longer wonder what she thinks of me. I no longer care if she regrets it. I don't replay the scenes anymore. I've already lived them once, and that's enough. I've made peace with the fact that I gave everything, and in return, I was given a warning to leave. So I did, and I took the house with me. She wanted me gone. Now I am. I hope the echo of my absence teaches her something silence never could. Because some lessons aren't shouted. They're felt. In the quiet. In the after. In the empty rooms you thought would always be yours. And if she ever wonders why, I hope she remembers her own words. You're not my responsibility. Because now, neither is she. What would you have done?